They were sent to fight Hitler's racial ideology while serving in an American army that enforced racial segregation of its own. And in the final days of World War II, as Nazi Germany collapsed, these men would drive their tanks into one of the most horrific places the regime tried to abandon and hide. History would later struggle to remember their names, but what they encountered cannot be forgotten. During World War II, the United States Army was segregated by race. Black Americans could be drafted, trained, and sent overseas, but they were rarely trusted with front-line combat roles. Most were assigned to labor battalions, supply units, or construction details. Military leadership widely believed that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage for complex battlefield operations, especially armored warfare. These beliefs were not based on evidence, but they shaped policy. Despite this, the scale of the war forced the Army to expand. On April 1, 1942, the U.S. Army activated the 761st Tank Battalion at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. It was an all-black armored unit, a rarity in a military that actively resisted integration. From the beginning, the battalion faced obstacles that white units did not. Training was prolonged and excessively scrutinized. Equipment was often outdated or insufficient. Promotions were limited. Mistakes that would be overlooked in other units were treated as proof that the experiment had failed. The men of the 761st trained for nearly 2 years in the Jim Crow South, where segregation extended beyond the base gates. They drilled knowing that many officers believed they would never see combat. Yet the unit forged a strong internal identity. They adopted the nickname the Black Panthers, and a simple motto that reflected their determination: come out fighting. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the 761st was still waiting. As American and British troops pushed inland, the fighting proved far more costly than anticipated. German resistance was fierce, especially against armored units. Tank losses mounted rapidly, and replacement units were in short supply. The U.S. Army could no longer afford to leave trained tank battalions unused. In October 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion was finally deployed to Europe. They arrived in France on October 10th and were assigned to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton was a deeply controversial figure, known both for his aggressive tactics and his openly racist views, but he was also pragmatic. He needed tanks, and he needed them fast. Before committing the 761st to combat, Patton addressed the unit directly. He made it clear that he did not care about their race, only whether they could fight. He also warned them that failure would be used as justification to deny black soldiers combat roles in the future. The message was blunt. The pressure was immense. The 761st entered combat on November 7th, 1944, near the French town of Morville-l'Évêque. This was their first engagement, and it came against experienced German forces entrenched in defensive positions. There was no gradual introduction to battle. From the start, they were expected to perform under fire, coordinating tank maneuvers with infantry while navigating minefields, anti-tank weapons, and artillery. They proved themselves immediately. Over the next weeks, the battalion supported American advances through eastern France and into Germany. They operated in harsh winter conditions, often in terrain ill-suited for tanks. Forests, narrow roads, and destroyed towns turned every movement into a potential ambush. German forces targeted American tanks relentlessly, knowing how vital armored support was to Allied advances. In December 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive, now known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st was rushed into the fighting as German forces attempted to split Allied lines. The conditions were brutal. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures plagued both sides. Visibility was poor. Tank crews operated under constant threat of ambush by German infantry armed with anti-tank weapons. Losses mounted quickly, tanks were destroyed, crew members were killed or wounded, but the 761st held their ground and continued advancing. Their actions helped blunt the German offensive and stabilize critical sectors of the front. By early 1945, the momentum of the war had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The 761st remained in near-continuous combat for 183 days, an extraordinary stretch by any standard. They fought across France, Belgium, and Germany, often attached to different infantry divisions depending on operational needs. Their role was consistent and dangerous: spearhead advances, support infantry assaults, and engage enemy armor when encountered. As winter gave way to spring, Nazi Germany began to collapse. Entire German units surrendered without firing a shot. Others fought fanatically to the end. The further Allied forces pushed east, the more evidence they encountered of crimes committed behind the front lines. Displaced civilians wandered roads. Prisoners of war appeared emaciated and barely alive. Rumors circulated among soldiers about camps where civilians had been worked, starved, and killed. In April 1945, the 761st crossed into Austria as part of the final Allied push. The war was clearly nearing its end, but the environment was increasingly unsettling. German authority had broken down unevenly. Some areas were abandoned. Others were scenes of chaos and desperation. The signs of mass imprisonment became impossible to ignore. The battalion continued advancing under orders to secure territory and eliminate remaining resistance. Maps did not always reflect what was on the ground. Intelligence was incomplete. In the confusion of a collapsing regime, many locations existed that had never been meant to be found. As elements of the 761st moved through the Austrian countryside near the town of Gunskirchen, they noticed something that did not fit the pattern of a battlefield. There was no organized defense. No military objective, yet the air carried a stench that veteran soldiers immediately recognized as death. They had no briefing, no warning, no preparation for what lay ahead. The tanks kept moving forward. As American forces pushed deeper into Austria in early May 1945, resistance thinned and then vanished altogether. What replaced it was something far more disturbing. Near the town of Gunskirchen, there were no fortifications, no weapons, and no enemy troops waiting to fight. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the low movement of people too weak to stand. The smell reached the soldiers before anything else. It was heavy, unmistakable, and unlike the odors of burned towns or dead animals that frontline troops had grown used to. Combat-hardened tankers stopped in their tracks, realizing this was something different. Behind trees and makeshift fencing stood crude wooden barracks, thrown together hastily as the Nazi regime collapsed. Bodies lay in open view. Some were motionless, others moved slightly, skeletal figures barely alive. This was Gunskirchen Lager, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp system. Gunskirchen was created only weeks earlier, in late March 1945, as Nazi authorities evacuated camps further west ahead of the Allied advance. Thousands of Jewish prisoners had been forced on death marches to this site. The camp was never properly supplied, guarded, or organized. It functioned as a holding area where prisoners were simply left to die from starvation, disease, and exposure. By the time American forces reached the area in early May, most SS guards had fled. The camp had been abandoned with more than 15,000 prisoners still inside. There was almost no food, no medical care, no sanitation. Survivors lay packed into the barracks or collapsed outside them, many unable to move or speak. Historically, the U.S. Army lists the 71st Infantry Division as the division that officially liberated Gunskirchen. Elements of American armored and infantry units moving with the advance, including black tankers from the 761st Tank Battalion, encountered the camp and its prisoners during this same window. These soldiers were among the first Americans to witness the conditions inside and begin trying to help the survivors. What they saw defied understanding. Prisoners were emaciated to the point that bones pressed visibly through skin. Many were naked or wrapped in rags. Disease spread unchecked. Corpses lay where people had fallen, sometimes stacked outside the barracks because there was nowhere else to put them. The soldiers acted immediately, despite having no guidance or preparation for such a situation. They called for medics and support units. They tried to distribute food, quickly learning that starving prisoners could die if fed too much too fast. Medical teams arriving later confirmed that refeeding syndrome was already killing survivors who had endured weeks without proper nourishment. Some prisoners clung to the soldiers' uniforms, terrified that the Americans would leave and the guards would return. Others were too weak to react at all. Liberation, for many, came too late. Thousands died in the days following the camp's discovery from starvation, disease, and total physical collapse. Gunskirchen would later be described by medical personnel as one of the worst camps encountered by American forces, not because it had operated the longest, but because of the sheer number of people abandoned there in such extreme condition. It was a final act of cruelty by a collapsing regime. For the men who witnessed it, the experience was shattering. These were soldiers who had fought through minefields, artillery fire, and tank battles for months. Many later said nothing in combat compared to what they saw at Gunskirchen. It permanently altered how they understood the war and what they believed they had been fighting against. And yet, the irony was impossible to escape. These black American soldiers had helped expose one of the most horrific expressions of Nazi racial ideology while serving in a U.S. Army that still segregated them by race. They liberated victims of a system built on racial hatred, only to return home to a country that denied them equal rights. After the war ended, the 761st Tank Battalion was quietly deactivated. Their combat record, which included 183 days of continuous fighting across France, Belgium, Germany, and Austria, received little attention. Many veterans returned home to segregation, limited job opportunities, and a lack of recognition for their service. It would take decades for their contributions to be formally acknowledged. In 1978, more than 30 years after the war ended, the 761st Tank Battalion was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism in action. Individual soldiers also received long overdue medals for bravery that had gone unrecognized at the time. Today, the legacy of the 761st stands as a testament to courage under injustice. They fought when they were told they were unfit to fight. They proved themselves in battle. And when faced with the evidence of mass murder, they did not turn away. They bore witness. When the world needed witnesses, they helped bring truth out of a place meant to be forgotten. And their story remains one of the most powerful and most overlooked chapters of the Second World War. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.